Thank you all for inviting me to give this talk. I'm delighted to do so. As you can see, my title is What is Distinctive About Critical Realism? Next slide, please. What I'm going to do is cover the 7 points you see listed that I think make critical realism distinct. The first 2 points cover critical realism, or CR's, understanding of causality and the methodological pluralism to which it leads. Specifically, we'll see that as opposed to the positivist approach to things, CR does not think causality is best expressed by mathematical equations or always best approached by statistical techniques. CR is more plural than that. Similarly, in opposition to positivism, CR does not endorse value neutrality. CR thinks that values are built into the social world we study and cannot be ignored without distortion. As a realism, critical realism also holds that there is an ontologically objective reality independent of what people or observers think about it, and that we can know the way this reality is. A lot of sociological paradigms out there are dismissive in various ways of human personhood. Practice theory wants to ignore what is going on in people's minds. Post-structuralism displaces people with discourses. Actor network theory seeks to make no distinction between people and things. In contrast, critical realism defends the full personhood of consciously acting people. And critical realism offers the broadest social ontology, encompassing structure, agency, and culture, what Maggie Archer has termed SAC. Other approaches are more reductive, some eliminating agency, some eliminating structure. And finally, building on its understanding of personhood, critical realism takes historical narrative as the model of human explanation, which is again captured by a term coined by Maggie Archer, the morphogenetic, morphostatic model. Slide 3, please. Next slide. So let me begin with the first 2 points about causality and methodology. Pictured here is Auguste Comte, one of the founders of sociology, who in 1819 coined the term positivism. Comte's so-called positive approach to society represented what Comte considered the third stage of human thought. In the first stage, Comte argued humans received their truths unthinkingly from religious authorities. The second stage, associated with the French Enlightenment, was an era in which existing social norms and beliefs were criticized on metaphysical or philosophical grounds. Comte characterized this critique as negative. In contrast, Comte's third stage was the positive optimism of social engineering. That's why he called it positivism, because it was positive. Comte's idea was to apply the same methods and principles of the natural sciences to society. Thus, just as the natural sciences search for universal laws governing physical things and processes, the social sciences would now search for universal social laws governing human behavior. Next slide, please. The understanding of causality we get is called the covering law model. Pictured here are the two Karls, Karl Popper and Karl Hempel, who in modern times gave the positivist model its name. According to the covering law model, causal explanation takes the form of a syllogism in which the event to be explained is logically deduced, or is a logical conclusion from the occurrence of a prior event, and the law linking that prior event to the event to be explained. The laws accordingly take an if-then form. If an event of type A occurs, then an event of type B will occur. Thus, if one asks why B has occurred, one can cite this law along with the occurrence of event A. Next slide, please. What you need for the covering law model to work are causal laws. So the job of the social scientist is to discover those laws. And Durkheim's suicide, Durkheim was another founder of sociology, Durkheim's suicide exemplifies how we go about doing that and the kind of sociological law you see here we can hope to end up with. Next slide, please. These laws can be expressed by mathematical equations. So you see Durkheim's law at the bottom expressed by an equation. The suicide rate of a society equals the level of social cohesion times some parameter. This is the positivist ideal of causal explanation. The equation itself becomes the explanation. Next slide, please. Of course, for this all to work, laws must be general, hence the methodological privilege of statistics. Next slide. This methodological privilege of statistics leaves us with a methodological monism. Ethnography is not scientific because it is anecdotal. That's participant observation. You cannot discover a law from one case. Same for other qualitative approaches, narrative history, for example. Without law-like generalizations, it's just description, not science. Next slide. 3 things to notice about the covering law model. First, for it to work, the laws must be deterministic. You cannot explain event B as a logical deduction from event A if the law says only that sometimes B follows A. If that is all we have, we would be left asking why B follows A when it does. So you need deterministic laws for the covering law model to work, or something very close. So the first thing to notice about the covering law model is that it requires determinism. A second thing to notice about the covering law model is that the laws relate only events, things that happen. A is an event, B is an event. Bhaskar, one of the founders of critical realism, calls this focus on events actualism. So with the covering law model, we have determinism and actualism. The third thing to notice is that in focusing only on connections between events, we are never told what it is about event A that makes B happen. What's the mechanism? How does A work? If the laws are deterministic, we don't need to ask. The causal power then is not in things, but in the laws connecting the events. The fatal problem with the covering law model is that we have no deterministic laws, nor anything even close. Without laws that are deterministic or closely deterministic, the covering law model is a failure, as is the conception of causality as involving laws. Critical realism offers a different understanding of causality. Next slide, please. Remember what I said. I said that with its focus on events, the covering law model ignores things themselves. With the covering law model, causal power is sucked out of the things and placed in the laws. The causal power is in the laws, not in the things. Critical realism returns us to the things themselves and their own causal powers. DNA has the causal power to transmit characteristics from one generation to the next. A car has the causal power to transport us. Social inequalities have the causal power to produce differing life chances. Next slide. For critical realism, causality is not about laws connecting events, that's actualism, but about the causal powers of things and the mechanisms through which those things cause other things to happen. And the mechanisms are all different. Pushing is different from pulling or telling time or ordering. Next slide. Science is not just about showing correlations among events, but about discovering the mechanisms that produce them. Consider what it means to discover the form of an atom or the DNA molecule. How do you express what these things are? Not by equations, but by description. A good part of science is describing the mechanisms that are out there. And you find out the mechanisms to be described by the qualitative methods that positivism devalues. So with CR, we recover methodological pluralism, ethnography, in-depth interviews, and discourse analysis. They all come back in. Next slide, please. So not only do we recover these qualitative methods, we also recover something else with CR. With critical realism narrative replaces equations as the form of a full explanation. We don't explain things with an equation anymore. We explain things with a kind of a story. In the open world outside a laboratory, you have many things with many mechanisms operating at once, interfering with each other, and often counteracting each other's effects. That's why we don't find any law-like regularities. At different times, we have different combinations of mechanisms in play that don't necessarily recur. Thus, to explain what happens in any particular case, you need not an equation, but a story, a narrative about how many different things coming together in time interact in such a way as to produce certain results. And this is true not just in the social sphere, but in the physical sphere as well. If we ask how we humans came to be, we need, again, not an equation, but a story involving many different mechanisms. How the universe started with a big bang, how stars coalesced, how our Earth was formed, and then how life began and went through stages of natural selection. A story, a chain of events connected by mechanisms. A story is a chain of events connected by mechanisms. So I've just gone through some complicated thoughts, so let me just say simply what you need to take away from the first 2 points. First, critical realism moves away from laws to examine things and the mechanisms through which those things work. That's the first thing, from laws to mechanisms. Second, with that move, descriptive methods to describe the mechanisms become as important as statistics. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, let me turn now to the third point I want to make, which is about value neutrality. The positivism that still dominates sociology subscribes to a rigid fact-value distinction. According to this distinction, facts are objective properties of reality, while values are subjective opinions in our head. So to be epistemically objective, that is, to have an objective appraisal of reality, positivism requires us as scientists to describe reality without the addition of our values. So we are supposed in Max Weber's famous formulation, to adopt a posture of value neutrality. The mistake is to think that values reside just in our heads and not also in the world. Oh, here's my cat who wants to get in. The problem is that some of objective reality consists of moral facts that have values built into them. In this slide, we consider an example from Bhaskar, who in turn got it from Isaiah Berlin. Stop it. The question is, which of the following is the most objective statement about the Holocaust? Most people will insist the most objective statement is 1. Why? Because they mistakenly equate objectivity with neutrality and with the absence of moral evaluation. They again assume that moral evaluation signifies something subjective. Moral evaluation signifies something subjective, they think, entirely in our head and not inherent in the object of evaluation itself. Surely, however, it is statement 3, the least objective of the 3, that is most true. Statement 3 is most true, most representative of the object that we're talking about, the Holocaust. When the object of consideration is the Holocaust, the truest account is that 6 million Jews were systematically murdered. The 2 more neutral accounts are not objective. Instead, their posture of neutrality actually misleads us about what happened. They convey impressions short of the full truth. Did 6 million Jews just die? Of what? Car accidents? In their sleep? Nor is it enough to say they were killed. They did not, after all, die in battle. They were murdered systematically. Here it is neutrality rather than partisanship that distorts. Critical realism thus rejects the absolute positivist separation of facts and values and the epistemic posture of value neutrality that follows from it. Thus, critical realism reintroduces moral considerations into social science research. That's a major reorientation of great significance. It's a reorientation that brings us to truth and objective reality, our 4th point. Next slide, please. I just showed the list again to help orient you. We are now at point 4. critical realism upholds truth and objective reality. We just talked about moral considerations. Moral considerations appear in social science primarily as moral critique. Domination, exploitation, oppression, for example, are all value-laden terms. They, like murder, rape, genocide, racism, designate moral facts. To be effective, moral critique presupposes truth. Morality is something different from taste or even custom. To accuse a society of racism or sexism charges more than just personal or customary preference. It charges an orientation out of line with a supra-individual standard. That standard even goes beyond custom, as I say, as customs too can fall under moral critique. To be effective, therefore, moral critique must be somehow grounded. It must be grounded in some kind of moral realism. That is, a view of moral standards as somehow absolutely justified, apart from personal or cultural preference. In short, there must be something truthful about the moral standard to which appeal is made, and truthful as well about any charge of deviation from that standard. Next slide, please. But what is truth? It's famously a question Pontius Pilate posed to Jesus. There are basically two answers: an epistemic understanding of truth and an ontological one. Next slide, please. Oddly enough, the epistemic understanding of truth is shared by positivism on the one side and by social constructionism and post-structuralism on the other. For the epistemic understanding of truth, truth is equated with some epistemic state. That is a state of belief, like certainty, personal certainty, or ultimate consensus. We all agree. What I'm saying is that according to the epistemic approach to truth, we reach the truth when we have certainty or consensus. That's Descartes you see here, who sought to reach certain truths about which he can be certain. How do we achieve these states? Positivism's answer is sometimes called foundationalism, which you see there, question. Foundationalism believes that truth will emerge automatically from following proper scientific guidelines like randomized controlled experiments. The social constructionists, however, in the social studies of science, have persuasively shown that truth does not emerge automatically from even the best designed experiments. Instead, results can always be contested rhetorically. So social constructionism and post-structuralism are anti-foundationalist in this sense. It follows that if we have no foundational methods that produce truth on their own, then as the social constructionists and post-structuralists say, we can never reach what could be called objective truth. Instead, like the classical Greek sophists, contemporary constructionists and social and post-structuralists argue that truth is something socially constructed rhetorically. As different societies and different groups construct truth differently, we must acknowledge that truth is relative. That is, each society group has its own truth. Next slide, please. Against the epistemic understanding of truth, which makes truth a function of our methods or our epistemic state, like certainty or consensus, what makes critical realism a realist is that it follows instead an ontological approach to truth. According to the ontological approach, truth is not about the methods through which we arrive at it or our state of mind, individually or collectively. That is, whether we ourselves are certain or collectively reach consensus. Instead, according to the ontological approach of critical realism, we have truth when what we say or what we believe corresponds to objective reality. Critical realism essentially upholds a common sense view here. That's what you see illustrated in this slide. You start with the premise that critical realists call ontological realism, that there's an ontologically objective reality independent of what anyone thinks. In the slide, objective reality is illustrated by the box and the pail and the ball. The box and the pail. Objective reality is illustrated by the box and the pail and the ball inside the box. That objective reality is what it is, regardless of what the observer thinks. That's what we mean by ontological realism. It doesn't depend on anyone's observation. According to the ontological approach to truth, what makes what we think true is, as in the slide, whether what we say or think matches what corresponds to objective reality. This is sometimes called the correspondence theory of truth, and most of us who are critical realists endorse it. According to the correspondence theory of truth, truth depends only on whether what we say or believe matches the objective reality, not in how certain we are or the method we use to reach our conclusions. The relativists always ask, who's to say? Who's to say what matches objective reality? For critical realism, the correct answer is that we ourselves individually are to say. Each of us has to say what we think is true. But what we say should reflect the best argument about what the objective reality is. Not what we want to believe, but what the evidence suggests we should believe. We critical realists thus affirm what is called judgmental rationality, which means that even though we all start from different places and have different thoughts about objective reality, which we should be respectful of, we can weigh the evidence for each position and arrive at what is most likely true. In simple cases, we can determine truth by mere inspection. I go to the car and see if my keys are there. In the slide, the observer can look inside the containers and see where the ball is. Most of the cases that interest us as social scientists are, however, more complex, not being decidable by simple inspection. Are women discriminated against in society? Is society becoming more secular? These questions cannot be decided by simple inspection. How then do we decide in these more complex cases what is true? According to the judgmental rationality upheld by critical realism, our best judgment about what is true is the best argument so far about what is true. This criterion is fallibilist, meaning that we could be wrong. For realists, our judgments about truth may be wrong even if we have consensus. Many past consensuses turned out not to match reality. Our judgments, according to critical realism, our judgments do not create the truth. The truth is determined by objective reality itself. But although the best argument does not create the truth, it remains our best guide to what the truth is. Before I leave this point, let me finally say that like social constructionism and post-structuralism, critical realism is non-foundational. For critical realism, there's no one method that leads to truth. The methods to be employed always depend on the research question being asked, and in complex cases, multiple methods will be needed. But because our judgments remain fallible, we must always remain open to new evidence and new arguments. Critical realists believe in truth, but not that we ourselves necessarily possess it. In contrast, the post-structuralists, if you listen to them, don't believe in truth, but they generally think as if they themselves possess it. Next slide, please. Let me now say a few words about personhood. Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialist, once declared existentialism a humanism. I've said the same thing about critical realism. What does it mean to be humanistic? To be humanistic is to affirm our reflexive selves, to say that we are that what we are as people is our reflexive selves who are morally conscious agents. So on the one hand, we're not just walking test tubes acting on chemical reactions inside us. Instead, we act within a field of reasons with a measure of free will that grounds our moral responsibility. Of course, to speak of moral responsibility presupposes someone or some self who is responsible. Thus, on the other side, critical realism resists the postmodern structuralist decomposition of selfhood. Postmodern post-structuralism argues that there is no coherent self that persists over time. What we take to be ourselves is just an often incoherent and fleeting intersection of different discourses, ways of talking. Discourses, however, do not act. They don't make choices. What acts are self-conscious, morally responsible agents, and that personhood of human agents is something that critical realism strongly affirms. Next slide. Personal agency is what the A stands for in the acronym SAC, coined by Margaret Archer. SAC is the name for the social ontology critical realism endorses. When we talk about ontology, ontology involves, among other things, what the categories are of existence. That is, what different kinds of things exist. So social ontology involves the kinds of things that exist in the social sphere. The tendency in the social sciences is to pay too attention to this ontological question. One result is that social categories get mushed together, or as Margaret Archer puts it, conflated. Alternately, very narrow ontologies are advanced where only one category of social thing exists. The most prominent example of such a narrow ontology is what used to be called methodological individualism. According to methodological individualism, all that exists in the social realm are individual actors with their wants and beliefs. Neither culture nor structure find any place. It is against this background of ontological narrowness that we need to appreciate Archer's SAC. Against monolithic social ontologies, SAC represents an ontological multiplicity, that there are different categories of things in the social world. There specifically, as the initial suggests, structure, agency, and culture. Next slide, please. I've already addressed what we mean by human agency, namely conscious, purposive, intentional action by humans based on reasons. So let me quickly go to, so that's the agency portion of SAC. So let me quickly go to culture and structure. Next slide. Culture refers to anything. You see like a wheel there with different things. Culture refers to anything from our words and thoughts to our creations that carry social meaning, shared social meaning. So besides words, buildings, airplanes, forks, and knives are not just instruments we use to make our lives better. In both their form and function, they also convey meaning to us. In all cases, though, meaning is something subjective. If it's shared, we call it intersubjective, like you see there. They're all thinking the same thing, but they're still thinking. So subjective, whether subjective or intersubjective, as something meaningful, culture relates to ideas in people's heads. And so it's said to be on the idealist end, meaning idea-related, on the ontological spectrum. It's idealist. Next slide, please. Social structure, on the other hand, so we've done agency and we've done culture. Social structure, on the other hand, is on the more material end of the ontological spectrum. It has less to do with ideas and more to do with objective reality. Social structure refers to the relations that bind us, how we're organized. Each of us occupies various social positions defined by their relation to other social positions. So as on the left there, a division of labor is a social structure, as are status hierarchies, power structures, and inequalities. Inequalities and relations of power can exist whether anybody in the society notices them or not. That's why they're more material. Next slide. Think, for example, of the balance between the number of jobs in a society and the number of job seekers. That ratio can have profound implications for people's life chances. But it can exist with consequences for us, whether anyone knows what that ratio is or not. Unlike culture, structure is not subjective or an intersubjective phenomenon. It's more material. Next slide. So SAC puts all of these things together, structure, action, and culture, and gives rise to what Margaret Archer calls the morphogenetic model. Okay, all the arrows can all the arrows you see there can be bewildering, but it actually is quite simple. Look at the bottom of the slide. What we want to do is explain why people behave the way they do. To explain behavior, we need to understand the social context in which people act. The context consists of actors' cultural setting and their positions within a social structure. That is where the action situation begins, with the culture and structural context. Social structural positions produce objective interests for the actors. Next slide. What I show here is the famous line from Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, where he describes kind of what we call the invisible hand. We expect our dinner, Adam Smith says, not from the benevolence of the butcher or brewer or baker, but from their attention to their interests. So this concept of interest is important. What's in your interests is something critical realism looks at. What are the interests of the butcher, the baker, and the brewer? To stay in business. To do that, it is in their interest to do better than their competition. So having competitors is a structural relation. Are you in a situation of competition? If so, that produces certain interests. Next slide, please. So look again at the bottom of the slide depicting the morphogenetic model. We started with culture and structure in which actors are placed, which leads us to consider actors' interests. Moving rightward, we examine the culturally informed ways in which the actors are motivated to act on their interests, taking into account as well their cultural values and beliefs. The results are either to reproduce or alter the cultural structure in which they started. And that is the morphogenetic model, despite all those arrows. It just says that actors are always beginning with a context that motivates their actions, and in the course of those actions, the actors reproduce or change the context. It's a circular or dialectical process. Next slide, please. In fact, the morphogenetic model is just a reworking of a basic, of a famous phrase of Karl Marx. People make their own history, but not in circumstances of their own making. They begin in certain circumstances, they act, and they either change or reproduce those circumstances. That's all. That's what the morphogenetic model is. People making their own history, but not in circumstances of their own making. Okay, next slide. To summarize, we've covered a lot of ground in a very short time. I hope it was clear. We've been discussing what is distinct about critical realism, and we've covered 7 points. Critical realism gives us a conception of causality alternative to the positivist covering law model, different from a view of causality involving laws. With that new understanding of causality, we get a methodological pluralism that vindicates qualitative approaches like ethnography and in-depth interviews. We learned that with critical realism, we drop the pose of value neutrality and take note of the value-ladenness of social life. Critical realism upholds an ontologically objective reality and our ability to determine what is true about it. Critical realism further upholds human personhood and a non-reductive ontology that encompasses structure, action, and culture as 3 distinct social categories. And we just finished with the morphogenetic model of social analysis to which the critical realist approach leads. Next slide. So thank you for your attention. I'm very pleased again to speak to you. And I suppose if you have questions, you can send them to me, email them to me. Thanks so much.